On the morning of September 6, 1869, the men of Plymouth Township, Pennsylvania, walked back into the Avondale Colliery for the first time in a week. A strike had just ended. The mules were harnessed, the cars were greased, and a little after 9 o'clock, the cages began lowering miners 300 feet down the Steuben shaft into the red ash vein. Most of them were Welsh. Some were boys, 12 and 13 years old, sent down to tend the doors that controlled the mine's airflow. By 10 o'clock, every one of them would be sealed underground with no way out. Not because a door had failed, because the mine had only ever had one. The Avondale Colliery sat on the bank of the Susquehanna River, 4 miles outside Plymouth. It had been sunk in 1867 by the Nanticoke Coal Company, a subsidiary of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, and it worked exactly the way most anthracite mines in the region worked at the time. A single vertical shaft went down to the coal. That same shaft carried men, carried coal cars, and carried the mine's air. At the bottom, a furnace burned constantly to create a draft, pulling foul air up and out, pulling fresh air down and in. It was a known and accepted design. It was also, by any modern standard, a trap with one door. Directly above the shaft stood the coal breaker, the towering wooden structure where raw anthracite was crushed and sorted. England had already banned this exact configuration, breaker built over shaft, because of the fire risk. Pennsylvania had not. So at Avondale, as at collieries across the state, thousands of board feet of dry timber sat stacked directly over the only hole that led back to daylight. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. At approximately 9:45 that morning, an engineer named Alexander Weir, working above ground, saw flame shooting up the shaft. He sounded the alarm whistle, the signal for the men below to clear the blasting powder from the mine before an explosion could follow the fire down. It was the last correct thing anyone could do for them. The fire had started in the wooden cribbing lining the shaft, almost certainly ignited by the same furnace that had been built to keep the mine breathing, and it climbed the shaft in minutes. By the time it reached the surface, it had already sealed the exit from underneath. The breaker went up next. Witnesses described flame moving from the shaft into the engine room, then into the boiler room, then into the breaker itself, consuming a structure built almost entirely of dry wood in what one reporter for the Luzerne Union called, in his account of arriving at the scene, a single common ruin. Within hours, thousands of people had gathered at Avondale. Some had walked from Plymouth. Some had come from towns further out along the river, drawn by word that had outrun any telegraph. There was nothing left above ground to save. What mattered was 300 feet down. Below, the miners understood their situation with a clarity that the surviving testimony makes almost unbearable to read. The fire had destroyed the air courses. Carbonic acid gas, what miners of the period called black damp, was filling the workings from the bottom up as the oxygen was consumed. Several of the men tried to brattice themselves in, building rough plank walls to seal off pockets of breathable air and buy time. It was the only tool available to them, and it did not work. One miner, Madison Alabor, had told his wife before that day that if anything ever happened to the mine, he knew exactly where to go to survive. She held on to that promise for 2 days while his body was still underground. He was found with the others. 2 rescuers died trying to reach them. Thomas Williams and a companion went down into the shaft in an attempt to get to the trapped men and were themselves overcome by the gas. Their names are recorded on the same lists as the miners they were trying to save, because the mine did not distinguish between the men who worked it and the men who tried to save the ones who did. Recovery began on September 8th, once the shaft had cooled and the gas had cleared enough to allow entry. It continued for 2 more days. The bodies came up one at a time on the cage that had carried them down alive. A coroner's report and newspaper accounts from the period described the condition in which many were found: hands clenched, faces marked by suffocation rather than burns, some found together, fathers with young sons in their arms. The last body brought up, on the morning of September 9th, belonged to a miner named John Powell. He was the 108th man recovered from inside the mine. 2 more had died on the surface trying to reach them. The final count stands at 110. 72 women were widowed that morning. 158 children lost a father. 1 congregation in Plymouth lost every man on its rolls. The numbers do not require embellishment. They are the numbers. A coroner's inquest opened 5 days later at Shupps Hall in Plymouth, and it produced a document that reads, "Even now, like an indictment written in the careful, hedged language of the era, the jury's finding placed the cause of death as suffocation from carbonic acid gas, brought on by the destruction of the air courses in the fire." But the jury did not stop at cause. It went further, stating for the record that it regarded the practice of mining through a single shaft as insecure and unsafe, and recommending that wherever practical, mines maintain 2 separate points of ingress and egress, along with a more adequate means of ventilation. A coroner's jury in a small Pennsylvania mining town in 1869 had just written the blueprint for the law that would follow. It took the state a little more than half a year to catch up to what 12 jurors already understood standing over 110 bodies. There is a bitter irony sitting at the center of the Avondale story, and it is not a suppressed one. It is documented plainly in the historical record. Pennsylvania had already passed its first mine safety law in April of 1869, 5 months before the fire, following lobbying by the newly formed Working Men's Benevolent Association under a labor organizer named John Siney. That law applied to Schuylkill County. It required ventilation, safety inspections, and communication systems between the surface and the workings. It did not apply to Luzerne County, where Avondale sat. A law written to prevent exactly this kind of disaster existed on the books 5 months before the disaster happened, in the wrong jurisdiction, reaching everywhere in the anthracite region except the one mine that needed it in September. John Siney was at Avondale on the day the recovered bodies were brought out to the waiting crowd. Newspaper accounts from the period describe him climbing onto a wagon before the assembled miners and their families, his face marked by what witnesses described as visible grief, and telling the men gathered there that if they had to die, let it be for their families and their homes, not like animals in a trap for owners who valued them no more than the tools in their hands. Whatever else can be said about the disaster, that moment is recorded, attributed, and consistent across multiple period sources. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The response that followed was not slow, and it was not quiet. In April of 1870, the Pennsylvania legislature passed the Anthracite Mine Ventilation Act, extending regulation across the entire anthracite region rather than a single county. It banned the practice of using one airway as both intake and exhaust. It mandated a second shaft or slope for every mine, so that fire or collapse at one opening could never again seal every man inside at once. It prohibited breakers from being built directly over a shaft. It required a mine boss to conduct a safety inspection before each shift began. Pennsylvania became, by a margin the record is unambiguous about, the first state in the country to establish a formal mine inspection system, a full 5 years before the next state, Ohio, followed in 1874. None of this came easily or completely. Coal operators resisted the new inspection requirements, and enforcement in the following decades was inconsistent at best. The anthracite fields would go on to see decades more of conflict between miners and owners, a struggle that would eventually produce both the trials and executions of the Molly Maguires in the following decade, and the long, grinding rise of organized labor in the coalfields that Avondale had helped set in motion. The Working Men's Benevolent Association, which had lobbied for the law that arrived too late for Avondale, saw its membership swell in the disaster's aftermath, as miners across the region understood for the first time, in a way no pamphlet could have taught them, exactly what a single point of failure 300 feet underground could cost. What makes Avondale worth returning to is not a hidden object or a sealed room or a missing page in a company ledger. Nothing here needed to be suppressed, because nothing here was ambiguous. A coal breaker sat on top of the only shaft into a mine that employed more than 100 men. Everyone involved, the company, the state, the miners themselves, understood on some level that this was a design built for efficiency and not for escape. It took 110 deaths, 72 widows, and 158 fatherless children for the law to catch up to what a coroner's jury had already written down within a week of the fire. The historical marker that stands today in Washburn Street Cemetery in Scranton lists the names of the dead. It does not need to argue for their significance. The law that bears their cost is still, in its descendants, the framework mine safety regulation in this country is built on. Relief for the families began almost immediately, and it did not stay local. Reverend T.B. Hunt of Wilkes-Barre opened discussions on an Avondale relief fund within a day of the fire, and by September 16th, trustees had already distributed $5,000 to widows and children facing an immediate loss of income, with no warning and no savings to fall back on. Donations arrived from well beyond Luzerne County. Newspapers as far away as Britain picked up the story, and money came in from readers who had never set foot in Pennsylvania, making Avondale one of the earliest mining disasters to draw what amounted to an international relief response, decades before that kind of cross-border giving became a familiar pattern after industrial catastrophes. The colliery itself did not close immediately. Mining resumed at Avondale in the years that followed, and men went back down the same vein, past the same stretch of shaft that had become a grave for 110 of their neighbors. It was not fire, war, or another accident that finally ended operations there. It was the Great Depression, decades later, that made the mine economically unworkable and shut it down for good. What remains today is comparatively little, and the Plymouth Historical Society has kept it that way on purpose. The colliery site carries markers explaining what happened there, rather than any reconstruction of the buildings themselves. A separate historical marker stands in Washburn Street Cemetery in Scranton, where many of the dead were laid to rest, and in September of 2019, on the disaster's 150th anniversary, a roll of honored dead was formally unveiled there, naming men whose graves had gone unmarked by any public record for a century and a half. The disaster also outlived its own newspaper coverage in an unexpected form. A folk song called The Mines of Avondale began circulating through the coal patches not long after the fire, sung in the same taverns and row houses where the dead had lived, carrying the count of 110 men smothered underground into a kind of oral memory that outlasted most of the official reports written about them. It is still sung today at commemorations in the Wyoming Valley, one of the few disasters from that era that Pennsylvania's coal country never stopped singing about. Money began arriving before the last body had even been brought to the surface. A relief effort took shape almost immediately, organized in part by a Wilkes-Barre minister named Reverend T.P. Hunt, and it grew into something that reached far beyond Luzerne County. Newspapers up and down the East Coast printed appeals. Churches took collections. By the time the fund closed its books, more than $155,000 had come in from strangers who had never set foot in Plymouth Township, and never would. On September 16th, 10 days after the fire, trustees made the first distribution, $25 to each widow, $10 to each orphan, just enough to buy a family a few more weeks. The fund kept paying out installments for years afterward. It was not finally exhausted until 1875, 6 years after the fire that created it, which tells you something about how long grief and poverty were expected to last in a company town once the wage earner was gone. Not everyone entrusted with retelling the disaster was a stranger to the men who died in it. Terence Powderly, who would go on to lead the Knights of Labour into the largest labour organisation in the country, was a boy in the crowd that gathered at Avondale in the days after the fire. Decades later, he wrote, of standing among the mourners and watching John Siney speak from a low rise near the ruined breaker, his back against a moss-covered rock, addressing men and women who had just watched their sons and husbands carried out of the ground one at a time. Powderly remembered it as his introduction to what organised labour could sound like when it was speaking directly to loss rather than to a legislature. He carried that memory into a career that would reshape the American labor movement, which means Avondale's fire helped light more than one union. A former congressman named Hendrick B. Wright, a Luzerne County lawyer with a long record of aligning himself, at least in print, with the interests of mine laborers, wrote an essay in the weeks after the disaster describing the public reaction as a convulsive shudder that had passed through the entire country. He wrote that people who had previously been indifferent to the dangers of mine work were now being forced to reckon with it, that the wail of the newly widowed could no longer be ignored by men willing to close their eyes to it. Wright's essay ran first in a Schuylkill County paper and was later folded into a longer published account of the era's labor struggles. Whatever his motives, his words capture something the record otherwise struggles to convey in dry statute language: the sheer scale of public horror that one single shaft fire had managed to produce. That horror did not translate cleanly into lasting protection, and the record is honest about that too. The ventilation law of 1870 was real, and its requirements were specific, but enforcement in Pennsylvania had been placed largely in the hands of the coal operators themselves as far back as 1868, a year before Avondale burned, and that arrangement persisted for decades afterward. Between 1869 and 1900, more than 10,000 miners died in Pennsylvania's anthracite region alone, with upward of 24,000 injured, a fatality rate that ran well above comparable rates in British coal mining during the same period. Avondale did not end the danger of anthracite mining. It gave the danger a name and a law, and then several generations of miners kept dying anyway, while operators found gaps in enforcement that the coroner's jury at Shupps Hall had not thought to anticipate. The dead themselves were not evenly distributed even in burial. 61 of the victims were laid to rest together in Washburn Street Cemetery in Scranton, their graves eventually marked by the same historical marker that lists their names today, a roll of the honored dead unveiled by descendants and historians a century and a half after the fire that killed them. Other victims were buried near their own home congregations, scattered across Plymouth, Hyde Park, and the smaller mining patches that ringed the Wyoming Valley. There is no single resting place for Avondale's dead, because there was no single community large enough to hold all of them at once. 110 men and boys had come from dozens of small Welsh and Irish enclaves stitched together along the river, and in death they went back to those same scattered places. One detail that surfaces in the local record, easy to miss, is the story of what came to be called, informally, the last widow of Avondale. Local historians and genealogists in the region have traced the lives of some of the 72 women left without husbands that morning, following them through subsequent decades of census records, remarriages, and, in at least one documented case, a woman who outlived nearly everyone else connected to the disaster before passing away herself many years later, having spent most of her adult life as a living link to September 6, 1869. She is not a footnote invented for effect. She is a real, named figure in local genealogical research, one of dozens of women whose entire adult lives were reorganized in a single morning by a fire that started in a shaft built to keep men breathing. The two rescuers who died trying to reach the trapped miners have their own small, precise place in the record as well. Their names were Thomas Williams and David Jones, and they went into the shaft together after the alarm had already made clear that the mine below was filling with gas. When they failed to report back, a second pair of volunteers went in after them and found both men already dead, which is how the rescue effort learned, in the worst possible way, that there would be no safe entry until the mine had been ventilated by force. That single grim discovery, two named men lost trying to save the others, is why recovery did not begin in earnest until 2 days later, once canvas brattices and a donkey engine fan had been rigged to push fresh air down through hoses into the workings. Avondale is remembered today mostly as a law, a shorthand for the moment Pennsylvania decided a mine needed two ways out. The fuller record insists on something harder to compress into a statute, a relief fund still paying widows 6 years later, a future labor leader shaped as a boy by a speech given over a mossy rock, a congressman's essay describing a nation forced to feel what it had been able to ignore, and 10,000 more deaths in the 30 years after the law was supposed to have made mining safer. The shaft is long since sealed. The names on the marker in Scranton are not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.